The village of Umuife was a place where tradition was not just respected, it was law. Every household, every family, and every child grew up with the weight of ancient customs resting on their shoulders. From birth to death, life in Umuife followed an order that no one dared to question. Among the most sacred of these customs was the rule, no one must pound yam at night. The elders told stories of those who had broken this rule, and none of them ended well. Some claimed that spirits of the ancestors roamed freely in the dark, searching for those who disturbed their peace. Others whispered that an old woman had once pounded yam after dusk and was never seen again, her mortar and pestle left behind, but her body lost to the night. Fear held the village together, even when hunger clawed a household, even when a child wept from starvation. The mortar and pestle remained untouched once the sun disappeared. Mama Nkechi knew this well. She had been raised with the same fear, just like everyone else. But fear alone did not fill an empty stomach, and as she stared at her 3 children huddled in the corner of their small hut, their eyes hollow with hunger, she wondered, was this tradition meant to protect them, or was it just another chain keeping them bound? Outside, the village was silent, except for the occasional cry of an owl. The moon hung high in the sky, casting pale light over the empty compounds. Somewhere in the distance, she could hear the rhythmic hum of night insects, the only sound in the darkness. Mama Nkechi swallowed hard. There was no food left in the house. No cassava, no maize, nothing except a few tubers of yam she had harvested earlier. If she waited till morning, her children would go another night with nothing in their bellies. She sighed and closed her eyes. The elders had warned, "You do not have to pound at night. If you do, you will bring misfortune upon yourself." But misfortune had already found her. Wasn't it misfortune that took her husband, leaving her alone to raise 3 children? Wasn't it misfortune that left her with nothing but dry yams and an impossible choice? She shook her head, pushing the thought away. Perhaps the spirits would understand. Perhaps, just this once, they would let her be. And so, deep in the heart of Umuife, Mama Nkechi made a decision that would change her life forever. She sat outside her small hut, staring at the lifeless embers of last night's fire. Her 3 children sat near her, their eyes dull with hunger. Chibuzo, the youngest, sucked on his fingers, a habit he had developed when food was scarce. Adana, her only daughter, sat beside him, combing through her tangled hair with weak fingers. Ike, the eldest at 10 years old, sat apart from them, kicking at the dry earth. Mama Nkechi's stomach twisted with guilt. It had been 2 days since they had eaten anything substantial. The little food she had left was not enough to satisfy them. She had once known a different life. Her husband, Obiora, had been a strong farmer, a man who worked hard and provided well for his family. Their compound had been filled with laughter and warmth. But death had a way of stealing happiness without warning. A fever took him suddenly, leaving Mama Nkechi alone to fend for their children. The villagers mourned with her, but mourning did not bring food to the table. As the months passed, the sympathy faded, and she was left to struggle on her own. She worked on other people's farms for small payments, carried firewood to the market, and did whatever she could to earn enough to buy food. But it was never enough. Hunger became a constant visitor in their home, whispering in the ears of her children, making their stomachs rumble like distant thunder. And now here she was, staring at the last few tubers of yam in her kitchen. She looked at her children again. Their small bodies had grown thinner, their once bright eyes dimmed by suffering. She couldn't bear it anymore. Mama Nkechi rose to her feet. Tonight, she would break the rule. Tonight, she would pound yam at night, even if the spirits came for her. Chibuzo clutched his tiny stomach, his face scrunched in pain. "Mama, my belly is making noise," he whimpered. Ike looked at his mother, his voice low and serious. "Mama, please make something for us to eat." Mama Nkechi couldn't answer. Adana, her daughter, sighed heavily. "Maybe if Papa were alive, we wouldn't be like this." Mama Nkechi's hands trembled as she wiped the sweat from her forehead. She had begged, she had worked, she had prayed. But the gods remained silent, and the villagers had little to give. As the last streaks of daylight faded from the sky, she glanced at the pile of yams in the corner of her small kitchen. She knew the rule. She had grown up hearing the warnings from the elders. The spirits walk at night. The ancestors do not like the sound of pounding when the land is asleep. She had obeyed all her life. But tonight, she would break the rule. She had no choice. Her children were hungry, and hunger was a force far greater than fear. Mama Nkechi sat in the dim glow of her fire, staring at the yams. Her heart pounded in her chest. For a moment, she hesitated. Her mother's voice echoed in her mind. "Never pound yam at night, my daughter. The spirits do not forgive." She swallowed hard and looked over at her children. Chibuzo had curled into a ball on the mat, too weak to cry. Adana rubbed her empty belly, her lips chapped from thirst. Ike sat awake, his eyes fixed on his mother, waiting for her to do something. She couldn't let them sleep hungry again. Mama Nkechi rose to her feet. Moving quickly, she peeled the yams and placed them in a pot of boiling water over the fire. The flames flickered, casting long shadows on the walls of the hut. She waited. Nothing happened. No spirits appeared. No whispers in the dark. Reassured, she took the heavy mortar and pestle outside. The night air was cool against her skin. She placed the mortar on the ground, then lifted the steaming yams from the pot. Carefully, she dropped them into the mortar and picked up the pestle. She took a deep breath. Then she began to pound. Thud, thud, thud. The sound echoed through the silent village. The first few strikes were steady, careful. Then she pounded harder, faster, her arms working furiously as she thought of her children's hunger, of the pain in their eyes, of the unfairness of it all. Thud, thud, thud. The pounding grew louder. The mortar shook with each strike. Then, suddenly, the wind changed. A cold breeze swept through the compound, carrying with it a strange whisper. The firewood crackled violently, the flames shrinking as though something unseen had passed over them. Mama Nkechi froze, her hands tightening around the pestle. The air around her felt heavy. The night, once peaceful, had turned eerily still. And then, a voice, low, hollow, barely above a whisper. "Who dares to pound at night?" Mama Nkechi's blood ran cold. Mama Nkechi's grip on the pestle tightened. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she looked around the dark compound. The voice had been faint, almost carried by the wind. Had she imagined it? She swallowed hard. Her heart pounded violently in her chest. But, she told herself, it was just fear playing tricks on her. The elders had filled their heads with stories to keep them obedient. That was all. She lifted the pestle again. Thud, thud, thud. Then, the fire dinned suddenly, the flames shrinking to weak embers. The air around her grew icy cold, unnatural for a warm village night. A deep, heavy silence fell. No crickets, no rustling leaves, no distant voices from night travelers. Just silence. Mama Nkechi stood still, sweat forming on her forehead. Her hands trembled. The pestle felt heavier than before. A sudden gust of wind rushed through the compound, strong enough to scatter dry leaves and send her wrapper flapping against her legs. And then, a shadow moved. Not a small flicker, not a trick of the firelight. A real, shifting shadow just beyond the compound's fence. Mama Nkechi's throat tightened. Her pulse roared in her ears. Her instinct screamed at her to run inside, to abandon the pounding, to pretend this night had never happened. But she thought of her children. They were waiting. She forced herself to breathe. Her voice came out shaky, barely above a whisper. "Spirits or not, my children will not sleep hungry." She lifted the pestle once more, ready to finish pounding. But before she could strike, the voice returned. Only this time, it was closer. "You have been warned." The wind howled and the fire went out completely. Darkness swallowed Mama Nkechi's compound. The fire had died in an instant, leaving only the faint glow of the moon. The air was thick, heavy, almost suffocating. Mama Nkechi's hands trembled as she gripped the pestle. Her ears strained for any sound, anything to explain what had just happened. Then she heard it. A whisper. Low, slow, cold. not from one direction, but from everywhere. You should not have pounded at night. Mama Nkechi's breath caught in her throat. The whisper was everywhere and nowhere, floating through the air like a cold breeze. She wanted to run, to grab her children and lock the door, but her feet felt rooted to the ground. Her heart pounded as she clutched the pestle, her knuckles turning white. Then the shadows moved. From the corner of the compound, where the moon barely touched, something emerged. An old woman, but not just any woman. Her eyes glowed like burning embers. Her skin pale and wrinkled, stretched tight over her bones. She wore a tattered white wrapper, and her feet hovered slightly above the ground. The air around her shimmered, as if the night itself bent to her presence. Mama Nkechi wanted to scream, but her voice failed her. The spirit stepped forward. "You have broken the law of the night," the old woman said, her voice hollow, echoing like it came from deep within the earth. Mama Nkechi's chest tightened. She had heard of spirits appearing to those who defied tradition, but she never thought it would happen to her. She dropped the pestle, her body trembling. "Please, my children were hungry," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The spirit's eyes darkened. "And now, you must pay the price." Mama Nkechi's knees buckled, but she forced herself to stay upright. The spirit loomed before her, its presence chilling the air. The wind had died completely, leaving only silence between them. "You have disturbed the night." The spirit's voice rang, neither loud nor soft, but carrying a weight that pressed against Mama Nkechi's chest. She swallowed hard, her mouth dry. "I meant no harm, my children. Hunger is not an excuse," the spirit interrupted. "The law was set for a reason." Mama Nkechi dared to glance at the ground, where the pestle lay motionless beside the mortar. The yam inside was half pounded, the meal unfinished. "Please," he said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I only wanted to feed my children." The spirit stared at her for a long moment. Then, it took a slow step forward. "You do not understand the danger you have brought upon yourself," the spirit said. "No one pounds at night, not because of fear, but because the night is not ours. It belongs to them." Mama Nkechi's blood ran cold. "Then?" she asked, her voice shaking. The spirit did not answer. Instead, it raised a bony hand and pointed toward the darkness beyond the compound. Mama Nkechi took a shaky step back, her pulse hammering in her ears. The shifting figures in the darkness did not move closer, but their presence thickened the air, pressing down on her like unseen hands. The spirit woman remained motionless, her glowing eyes fixed on Mama Nkechi. "They have come for what is theirs," the spirit said. Mama Nkechi's lips trembled. "I don't understand. I pounded yen, but I didn't take anything from them." The wind howled and the whispers swelled, no longer faint but circling around her like voices carried by the night. "You took peace," the spirit said. "You disturbed the silence that keeps them at rest. And now, they will take something in return." A sharp crack echoed through the compound. Mama Nkechi turned toward the sound. Her door had swung open. Her heart nearly stopped. She had locked that door before stepping outside. "No, no, please," she cried, rushing toward the hut. But the moment she moved, the whispers turned into laughter, low, eerie, and everywhere. Something cold brushed past her shoulder. Her blood turned to ice. She didn't see anything, but she felt it, a hand, unseen but solid, grazing her skin. She screamed. The spirit woman remained still, her expression unchanged. "You were warned," she said simply. Mama Nkechi ignored her. She dashed inside the hut, her heart pounding so hard she could barely think. Her eyes darted around frantically. Her children lay asleep, untouched. She exhaled in relief, until she saw Chibuzo's fingers twitching in his sleep. Mama Nkechi stumbled backward. "Mama, why did you pound at night?" The whispers outside grew louder, laughing, mocking. The unseen figures in the darkness shifted closer. Tears burned in Mama Nkechi's eyes as she knelt beside Chibuzo, shaking him. "Chibuzo, wake up!" His eyelids fluttered, but his body remained unnaturally still. Then, his head turned slowly toward her, too slowly, too stiffly. When his eyes opened, Mama Nkechi's breath caught in her throat. His eyes were not his own. They were dark, too dark. like twin wells of blackness, swallowing all the light around them. You broke the law, the voice inside Chibuzo whispered. And now we are here, Mama Nkechi sobbed, gripping her son's shoulders. Leave my child alone. He has done nothing. Chibuzo's lips curled into a smile that did not belong to a child. But he is yours, and your sins are his. His small hands reached up, grabbing Mama Nkechi's wrists with an unnatural strength. She gasped, struggling to free herself, but his grip tightened. Adana stirred on the mat. Ak groaned, rubbing his eyes. The other children were waking. What's happening, Mama? Adana's sleepy voice was thick with confusion. Mama Nkechi couldn't answer. Cold fear locked her throat. Chibuzo sat up, still gripping her wrists. His little body trembled, but the thing inside him was strong. The door to the hut slammed shut on its own. Outside, the wind howled. The whispers turned into a terrible, screeching wail. And then, the spirit's voice echoed inside the hut. They do not forgive. Tears streamed down Mama Nkechi's face. She had only wanted to feed her children, but now something else had come to feed on them. Outside, the wind howled. The whispers turned into a terrible, screeching wail. And then, the spirit's voice echoed inside the hut. They do not forgive. Tears streamed down Mama Nkechi's face. She had only wanted to feed her children, but now something else had come to feed on them. Mama Nkechi's heart pounded as Chibuzo's grip tightened around her wrists. His small fingers dug into her skin, cold as death. Her son was still in there somewhere, but this thing inside him, this presence, was not her child. The hut had grown impossibly dark. The fire had died outside, and the only light came from the faint glow of the moon through the thatch roof. The other children sat up, their faces twisted in fear. Adana clutched Ike's arm. Mama, what's wrong with Chibuzo? Mama Nkechi couldn't answer. Chibuzo's head tilted, too sharply, too unnaturally. His dark eyes bore into hers, and that eerie smile remained on his lips. You broke the law, he whispered. Mama Nkechi sobbed. Please, take me instead. Spare my child. The thing inside Chibuzo laughed, a sound too deep, too hollow for a child. No, it said, we do not bargain. The whispers outside grew louder. The spirits were near. The wind rattled the walls, shaking the hut like unseen hands were clawing at it. Shadows flickered in the corners, stretching and twisting, creeping closer. Mama Nkechi turned to the spirit woman, who still stood at the doorway, her glowing eyes watching. Help me, Mama Nkechi cried. Tell me what to do. The spirit's expression remained blank. You were warned, she repeated. Mama Nkechi's body shook with rage and desperation. I was desperate. My children were starving. The spirit finally moved, stepping forward. The air shifted around her as if time itself bent to her presence. Then you must do what no mother wants to do, the spirit said. Mama Nkechi's stomach twisted. What do you mean? She whispered. The spirit's voice was low, final. You must break the connection before it takes root, or you will lose him forever. Mama Nkechi's blood ran cold. How? The spirit held out a hand. In her palm lay a small, rusted blade. Cut his skin, the spirit said. Draw his blood. If the spirit has not fully claimed him, it will flee. But if it has already settled, she paused. Then he is no longer yours. Mama Nkechi's hands trembled as she reached for the blade. Chibuzo's lips curled. Mama, he said softly. His voice was no longer his own. If you love me, you won't hurt me. Tears blurred Mama Nkechi's vision. Her hands shook. Her child was trapped, and she had to decide. Save him, or lose him forever. Mama Nkechi gripped the rusted blade, her hands trembling. Chibuzo's dark, hollow eyes bore into hers, his unnatural smile stretching across his small face. Mama, if you love me, you won't hurt me. Her heart shattered. Her son's voice, but not her son. The hut trembled, the whispers outside rising into a shrill, inhuman wail. The other children huddled together, their wide eyes filled with terror. The spirit woman stood still, waiting. You must act now, she said, or he will be lost. Mama Nkechi choked back a sob. Could she do this? Could she cut her own child? Her hands shook as she lifted the blade. Forgive me, my son. She lunged forward, and Chibuzo moved, faster than any child should. His small hands cut her wrist, stopping the blade in midair. Mama Nkechi gasped. His grip was no longer cold. It burned. A sharp, searing pain shot through her arm, like fire crawling under her skin. "Foolish woman," the voice inside Chibuzo seared. "You think a mere blade can cast me out?" His fingers tightened. Mama Nkechi screamed. The hut exploded with darkness. The weak moonlight vanished, and the air thickened, suffocating. The whispers turned into ear-piercing laughter. Then, a new voice rang out. "Leave my brother alone." Mama Nkechi barely saw it happen. Adana moved. The girl grabbed the blade from her mother's hand and, with a sobbing cry, slashed it across Chibuzo's small arm. A deep, unnatural shriek filled the hut. The darkness ripped apart. Chibuzo's body jerked violently, his limbs thrashing as if unseen hands were pulling at him. The children screamed. Mama Nkechi reached for her son, but the spirit woman's voice rang out. "Do not touch him." Chibuzo's mouth opened in a silent scream, his body convulsing. The blackness in his eyes spilled up like smoke, writhing in the air. The shadows in the hut screeched, and then, like mist in the morning sun, they vanished. The fire outside rekindled itself. The whispers stopped. The air cleared. And Chibuzo, her son, collapsed, his small body going limp on the floor. Mama Nkechi lunged forward, gathering him into her arms. His skin was warm again. His breathing was ragged, but his eyes, when they fluttered open, were his own. "Mama." His voice was weak. Mama Nkechi sobbed, holding him close. "I'm here, my son. I'm here." The spirit woman watched them, her face unreadable. "The debt is not paid," she said, "but the child is spared. Tonight." Mama Nkechi barely heard her. All that mattered was the small heartbeat against her chest. Chibuzo was back, but the spirits had not left empty-handed. Chibuzo lay weak in Mama Nkechi's arms, his tiny frame trembling. His breath was shallow, his body drenched in sweat, but his eyes were his again. Mama Nkechi rocked him gently, whispering prayers of gratitude. The spirit woman remained at the doorway, her glowing eyes unblinking. The night was silent once more. The wind had calmed, the whispers had faded, but the weight in the air had not lifted. "The debt is not paid," the spirit repeated. Mama Nkechi stiffened. Her arms instinctively tightened around Chibuzo. "But you said he was spared," she cried. The spirit tilted her head. "He was, but the law remains broken." The night was disturbed, and the spirits do not leave empty-handed. Mama Nkechi's stomach twisted. What do they want?" The spirit woman stepped forward, her ethereal form casting no shadow. "A life was promised the moment you struck the mortar. You defied the warning. The spirits came for their due. Your child was claimed, but you fought, and he was freed." Mama Nkechi's throat dried. "So what happens now?" she whispered. The spirit woman gazed at her for a long moment before speaking. "A trade must be made." The words crashed into Mama Nkechi like a blow. "A trade," she repeated, her voice barely a breath. The spirit nodded. "A life must replace what was taken. The spirits demand balance." Mama Nkechi's hand shook. "No, I won't let them take my son. They will not take him." The spirit said, "They will take you." Mama Nkechi froze. The words seemed to echo, stretching the silence. "Me," she whispered. The spirit nodded. "Your life in exchange for his. The spirits have accepted this trade." A heavy silence fell. The children gasped. Adana clutched her mother's arm. "No, Mama, please." Her life, for Chibuzo's, her body trembled, but deep in her heart, she had already known. She had broken the law, she had awakened them. She had made the mistake, and now she had to make it right. Tears burned her eyes, but she lifted her chin. "If I go with them, will my children be safe?" The spirit did not blink. "They will never be touched again." Mama Nkechi exhaled shakily. Her children, her everything, a trade, a mother's sacrifice. Slowly, she kissed Chibuzo's forehead, then turned to Adana, Ike, and the others. "Take care of each other," she whispered. Adana sobbed, shaking her head. "No, Mama, don't leave us." Mama Nkechi cupped her daughter's face. forcing a smile through her own tears. I will always be with you. Then, before she could lose her resolve, she turned to the spirit woman. I'm ready. The spirit inclined her head. The hut darkened. The whispers returned. The last thing Mama Nkechi heard was her children screaming her name. Then silence. The hut was eerily still. The children sobbed, their voices raw with grief. Mama Nkechi was gone. Adana's fingers dug into the earth as she sobbed. She had always thought their mother was invincible. She had fought for them, starved for them, defied the spirits for them. And now, she had given her life for them. Chibuzo, still weak, leaned against her. His small hand clutched at her dress. Mama is coming back, right? He whispered. Adana bit her lip to stop herself from crying again. Ak turned away, his jaw clenched. He knew the truth. They all did. Mama Nkechi was not coming back. Outside, the villagers had begun to stir. News of what had happened in the night had spread like wildfire. Women whispered in hushed voices. Men avoided looking toward the hut. No one spoke of pounding yam at night anymore. The taboo had been tested and the price had been paid. Later that morning, an elder approached. He was an old man with deep lines on his face, his cane tapping against the ground. He stood before the children, his gaze sullen. Your mother was a brave woman, he said. She fought against what should not be fought, and she paid the price. Adana wiped her tears. She saved us, she said fiercely. She saved Chibuzo. The elder nodded. Yes, and because of her, the spirits have left this land in peace. Silence fell. Then, the elder's voice dropped lower. The law remains. No one will ever pound at night again. The words sent a shiver down Adana's spine. This was their mother's legacy, not just her sacrifice, but her warning. Some things should never be challenged. That night, the children gathered in their mother's hut for the first time without her. The air felt different, but they knew deep in their hearts that she was still with them, not in body, but in spirit. And as the wind whispered through the trees outside, it almost sounded like a mother's voice, carrying a final message through the night. Take care of each other. The children held on to one another, their mother's love wrapping around them like an invisible shield. The spirits had taken her, but they had not won. And in the village of Umuife, no one not ever again pounded at night.